I welcome you most warmly to St Mary Le Bow and to the Boyle Lecture tonight. When I was being selected for ministry in what is practically another age, I had a recent history of gastric trouble, then popularly allied to stress and now known to be wholly bacterial and knocked on the head with antibiotics. So I was sent to a practitioner by the ordination selectors and declared not to be mad. The question arises, was that true, and does it matter? Certainly the implication was then that if some mental disturbance had been detected, I would never have been ordained. Decades later, I happened to be organizing a session for clergy on handling mental health issues. The focus was intended to be skills for pastoral care, but the speaker misunderstood and delivered a stunning presentation on the risks to the mental health of the clergy themselves. I had not one complaint. A further question might be, how far is the ordained life, close to the springs of the gospel, a working out of the psychological needs of individual ministers for good or ill? Curiously, although the narrative of Christian truth is not now as well known, the archetypes of religion still seem to have pathological force. As a trustee of a mental health charity myself, I am broadly careful not to wear my clerical collar when among clients. A further question might possibly be whether certain religious ideas are themselves pathological while others are not. A therapist listened as a client claimed to be full of the Holy Spirit and famously noted down use of inappropriate language. Some polls suggest that up to 40% of Americans reject the theory of evolution, presumably for religious reasons, but plainly no such large proportion of a nation can be mentally ill. Nick Spencer of Theos has lately posited that the vaunted opposition between religion and science, far from being about the existence of God, the age of the earth, or the nature of creation, is rather about the nature of the human, and most particularly, who has the right to define that. Concepts of what it means to be healthy, normal, or flourishing will plainly influence such a debate. The relationship between the Boyle Lecture and the International Society for Religion and Science continues apace, and we register thanks to its officers and administrators for continuing and efficient collaboration this year. Our thanks are due tonight to the Worshipful Company of Mercers, who together with the Grocers' Company provide the institutional and charitable ballast for this now mature and admired project, as also to the Advisory Board of the Boyle Lectures, which bears responsibility for the choice of lecture and handsomely chaired by today's Boyle Zion, Jonathan Boyle, the Earl of Cork and Orrery. Thanks are due to staff and others working here this evening who make, as I trust, the arrangements wholly satisfactory and comfortable for us all. As always, the lecture will be available to you as you leave by the north door and shortly on the ISSR and parish websites. So it is my great privilege and pleasure to introduce the President of ISSR, the Reverend Professor Michael Rice.
Thank you very much, George, and good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be able to introduce the Reverend Professor Chris Cook, who is to give the 2020 Boyle Lecture. Chris trained first in medicine at St George's Hospital Medical School, qualifying in 1981. Indeed, Fraser Waltz kindly tells me that Chris is thought to be the first Boyle lecturer to be medically qualified. Chris then specialized as a postgraduate in psychiatry at Guy's and St Thomas's. And following this, his clinical and academic interests in psychiatry were largely in the field of addictive behavior, and especially alcohol misuse. Chris held positions as lecturer at University College London, senior lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry London, and professor of the Psychiatry of Alcohol Misuse at the University of Kent. He then moved to Durham in 2003, initially as a college chaplain, but also in order to continue his academic work in applied theology in the university. And he's currently director of the Centre for Spirituality, Theology and Health. Chris's most recent monograph, Hearing Voices, Demonic and Divine, provides a theological engagement with the latest scientific research on hearing voices, much of which he has undertaken himself. The book was published in December 2018, and I'm delighted to say it is open access, so any of us can download it without having to pay. Chris is executive editor of the Journal for the Study of Spirituality. He's a past president of the British Association for the Study of Spirituality, a previous chair of the executive committee of the Special Interest Group. I think you get the general idea. I could go on some time, but I just want very briefly to mention Fraser Waltz, who will be responding to Chris at the end. I've known Fraser a great deal longer than I've known Chris, because we got ordained at about the same time, and Fraser's had a long and distinguished career combining both psychology and theology. Indeed, for many people, he's best known as being the holder of the first Starbridge lectureship. He then got promoted subsequently at the University of Cambridge. He's a past president of the International Society for Science and Religion, and on a personal note, apart from being a friend, perhaps I can say I'm extremely grateful that he's been executive secretary of the Society for about 5 or 6 years, which basically means you do most of the work that needs doing. Chris, we are delighted to welcome you, and we are very much looking forward to what you have to say to us.
Michael, thank you for your very kind introduction. In the ongoing dialogue between science and theology, certain topics seem to reoccur with great frequency. Creation, which has just been alluded to, cosmology, quantum physics, evolution, the emergence of the human soul and spirit are all favourites. But other topics seem to be discussed much less than you might imagine they would be. Amongst these neglected or avoided topics of conversation, medicine in general and mental health in particular are especially conspicuous by their absence. And this is reflected in the records of the Boyle Lectures. Unfortunately, we don't have a comprehensive record, but as far as I can see, lectures were given for at least 193 of the last 329 years, and none of these were on medical topics. 101 different lecturers have delivered these lectures and sermons, and yet it would seem that I am the first ever medically qualified lecturer. I can't imagine that Robert Boyle would have approved of this. The only university degree that he ever acquired was that of Doctor of Medicine, honoris causa. One can see in his medical writings the early development of what we might call evidence-based medicine, albeit still very rudimentary. And given the exponential growth in the medical and health sciences since Boyle's day, I think he might be rather pleased that after all these years, we have finally got around to giving attention to the topic. So my subject this evening will be mental health, and I trust that I do not need to explain why this is so very important in our day. Depending upon exactly which diagnoses we include, around 1/5 to 1/4 of people worldwide experience a mental health problem at some point in their lives. Mental disorders account for 1/3 of years lived with disability worldwide, making them by far the leading cause of disability. Moreover, mental health problems challenge our very experience of ourselves as human beings and our relationships with one another and with God. When our mood, our perceptions, our cognitive functioning, or our behaviour are distorted by dysfunction of brain or mind, we are confronted with the most important questions as to who we are and what it all means. If I hear a voice from heaven telling me that God is pleased with me, am I having a profound religious experience, or am I suffering from schizophrenia? If dementia robs me of my ability to remember my own recent history, changes my personality, and prevents me from managing my own affairs, in what sense am I still me? If my depression leaves me feeling that God has abandoned me, no amount of reassurance from others may be sufficient to re-engage with the love that I used to feel. We now have at least partial scientific answers to all of these questions, but they are also all important theological questions, and we have yet to properly connect the dialogue between science and theology in such a way as to find a basis for pastoral and clinical care that is wholeheartedly life-giving in spiritual terms. But before we can make these dialogical connections, we have some bridges to build across an ugly great ditch that separates mental health and theology. Some of you will recognize an implicit quotation here from Gotthold Lessing, and I shall return to that later. But for now, let's look at how this ditch operates in mental health practice. Let's suppose that a Christian woman becomes depressed. We will call her Agnes. Agnes's GP, or perhaps a psychiatrist, may prescribe antidepressants for her, or she may see a clinical psychologist for cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. Agnes is withdrawn, lacking in energy and dispirited in faith. She cannot face going to church as she would usually, and members of her church do not know how to deal with all of this. Like much of the rest of society, they are ignorant about and afraid of mental illness. The social exclusion and the associated stigma that Agnes experiences because of this deepens her sense of alienation from God, church, community, family, and herself. Happily, Agnes is receiving medical help, but the general approach to this within her church is similar to what would have happened if she had gone into hospital for surgery. The only difference is that people are less likely to be sympathetic, and she won't be sent any cards or flowers. The doctors are expected to get her better, and then she will be able to return to her normal life. Meanwhile, folks in church continue with the things that Agnes cannot do because of her illness. They pray, they read the Bible, they receive the sacraments, they talk about their faith. Agnes is excluded from all of this. If she is lucky, she might get to see a mental health chaplain in the NHS. He or she may well try to reassure Agnes that God does love her. But the emphasis in recovery will be on continuing with the medical treatments, which alone will be expected to get Agnes better. I am caricaturing slightly, but only very slightly. Mental health and Christian salvation are in different compartments of life, separated by a deep and unfathomable chasm. Doctors deal with the former, clergy deal with the latter. The former can be addressed through science. The latter is addressed by theology, spirituality, and biblical studies. I should note in passing that there is a different version of Agnes' story within which the insights of medicine and science are eschewed and faith alone is seen as an effective remedy. This is not an uncommon occurrence worldwide and is evident in some churches in the UK, but it is really just a different version of the same thing. Mental health and Christian salvation are seen as belonging to different social compartments, one of which, in this case the medical and scientific view of mental health, is seen as having little or no value. There is still no constructive dialogue between theology and science. And of course, there are yet others, mainly outside the Christian churches, who see no value in theology at all. For them, science has, or one day will have, all the answers. Theology and religion add nothing meaningful or valuable to a critical account of human flourishing. It all adds up to the same thing, a great big ugly ditch between mental health and Christian faith. And this story is replicated in other faith traditions, although I will not be talking about them this evening. For their part, medicine and science have begun to realize the need to build a bridge across this chasm. There have been huge advances in recent years, although there is still much professional debate about whether, where, and how to build the bridge. For example, in 2011, the Royal College of Psychiatrists adopted a position statement, Recommendations for Psychiatrists on Spirituality and Religion, in which the importance of sensitively addressing spiritual and religious needs in clinical practice was affirmed. In 2015, a similar policy document was approved by the World Psychiatric Association. And these developments have come about, at least in part, because of an explosion of scientific research interest over the last 40 years or more in the ways in which spirituality and religion impact upon mental health. Generally speaking, and notwithstanding some important exceptions, we now know that spirituality and religion seem to be good for human well-being. People who belong to faith communities are less likely to suffer from common mental disorders and tend to have better outcomes following treatment when they do. In at least some cases, spiritual and religious interventions specifically benefit recovery. There have been some problems and setbacks in building the foundations of this bridge from the scientific side. Mental health professionals are more likely to be atheist or agnostic than their patients, leading to a so-called religiosity gap, and concerns have been raised about proper ethical and professional boundaries. Much of the earlier research was of poor quality, and although methodologically rigorous research is now appearing, and with significantly positive results, the effect size of the impact on mental health variables is often modest. More importantly, spirituality has proven to be an especially difficult variable to measure. Early questionnaires and interview schedules sought to probe the essence of spirituality by way of questions about such things as relationships, meaning and purpose in life. For example, the Spiritual Well-Being Scale, devised by Paluzzian and Ellison in 1982, comprises 20 self-report items, each requiring a response on a 6-point scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. 10 items are addressed to religious well-being and 10 to existential well-being. And the existential questions are especially problematic. For example, is the item, I feel that life is a positive experience, really about spiritual well-being? Or is it a measure of psychological state or trait? It is spurious to suggest that we have learned anything by discovering that people who respond negatively to such questions are also depressed. The so-called measure of spirituality is simply measuring one aspect of depression. The same problem arises with virtually all of the questions designed to tap into spirituality. In practice, it is impossible to ask about spirituality in such a way that the answers will not be shaped by psychological well-being. Spiritual and psychological well-being are not separate variables. They are confounded with each other. So significant is this problem that Harold Koenig, the leading researcher in the field in the world today, now advocates the abandonment of spirituality as a research variable in healthcare, preferring to focus instead on measures of religiosity. Spirituality is a useful thing to talk about in clinical practice, but it has no value for scientific research. Instead, Koenig advocates use of instruments such as the Duke University Religion Index, the first two questions of which are, how often do you attend church or other religious meetings? How often do you spend time in private religious activities such as prayer, meditation, or Bible study? At least the answers to these questions are, in theory, objectively measurable. The answers do not depend upon the mental state of the person concerned. The first question addresses organizational religious activity, and the second addresses non-organizational or private religious activity. But important though such questions are, we might wonder whether they really get to the heart of the matter. 3 further questions address intrinsic or subjective religiosity, a concept concerned with beliefs and experiences. But again, these look much more vulnerable to psychological influences. Koenig has deliberately excluded all questions addressing extrinsic religiosity, a construct originally distinguished from intrinsic religiosity in a seminal paper by Allport and Ross in 1967. Intrinsic religiosity is concerned with what Allport and Ross called the master motive in life. Extrinsic religiosity serves to create a social impression, or as they put it, I quote, turning to God, but without turning away from the self, close quote. A large body of research has now confirmed that mental health is generally better in people with intrinsic religious orientation. But can we really separate out the master motive in life from the psychological apparatus that enables us to form motivation? For scientists such as Koenig, the turn to measuring religiosity is completely understandable. But as a theologian, I am left wondering, if science can't remove all vestiges of the psychological from its attempts to understand and measure the spiritual, can we, as theologians, do any better? Why do we think that we can separate out the spiritual and the psychological? Perhaps they are completely inseparable. Perhaps each needs the other to fully articulate its own essence. And if this is so, then how does it come about that in practice we go about our lives apparently separating them out on a daily basis? And how is it that theologians and biblical scholars continue to largely neglect the domain of mental health and well-being in much of their work? In order to probe these questions a little further, I would like to speak about the particular interface that forms the title of my lecture today. What is the connection, if any, between mental health and the Christian gospel? Are they really completely different things with a deep chasm in between? Or are they actually parts of the same landscape? So let's take mental health first. It's important to observe that in practice, when we talk about mental health, we often mean mental illness. This negative view of mental health, where it is actually referring to diagnosable mental disorder, is important within mental health services. Psychiatric diagnoses, when they are working properly, provide a useful guide to treatment and prognosis. They help to get people back on the road to recovery. On the other hand, when they become the basis for stigma, social exclusion, and prejudice, thus further adding to the disability imposed by impaired mental functioning, we could well do without them. But all of this is to focus on the negative. What is mental health in a positive sense? There have been many, often inadequate, attempts to define this, but let us look at the definition offered by the World Health Organization. Mental health is a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. The WHO defines mental health not as the absence of mental disorder, but rather in terms of capacity to cope with life and to contribute positively in the wider community. The WHO does not mention family, which I feel is a glaring omission. Families usually feel the burden of mental ill health most keenly. And I think this definition also overemphasizes work, and it does not mention spirituality or religion at all. However, it does at least define mental health in relationship. Mental well-being is experienced in community, not in isolation. And it also hints at vocation. Mental health is about productively and fruitfully realizing our abilities in relationship with others. So much for mental health. What about the gospel? I have deliberately juxtaposed these two concepts as conversation partners because I think that they are representative of the two compartments of life about which I have been talking. Mental health is the domain of medicine and science. The gospel is the domain of the church. we do not expect that scientists can tell us anything about the gospel. According to the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, the gospel is the central content of God's revelation as received by Christians. It is the good news about Jesus of Nazareth. The Greek noun, euangelion, and its derivatives are used more in the New Testament by Paul than by any other writer, but Paul seems to assume that his readers will know what he means by it. He offers us no definition. The word draws on a Hebrew theme of the proclamation of good news from God for the poor, and possibly also on Greco-Roman usage in reference to joyful tidings on festival occasions. More importantly, the gospel seems to have been something that early Christians associated with Jesus' own understanding of his mission. It is a theme that is taken up by Mark in his account of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. In different ways, and to a lesser extent, it is taken up also by Matthew and Luke. A focus on certain Pauline writings, however, has sometimes led to an emphasis on the gospel as concerned primarily with sin and atonement. And this does not do justice to the broader scope of Paul's thinking. Tom Wright, one of the leading contemporary authorities on Paul, has suggested that Paul's gospel is, quote, a message primarily about Jesus and about what the one true God has done and is doing through him. Paul understood the gospel as being the whole story about Jesus. And similarly, in later usage, Christians began to refer to the written accounts of the life of Jesus as gospels. In a sense, we might say, the gospel is Jesus. It is the good news of what Jesus said and did. I hope that in this very brief excursus, I have gone some way to convincing you that we may understand the gospel as the very heart of the Christian way. It is firmly on the Christian side of the great ugly ditch, with the science and medicine of mental health equally firmly on the other side. However, as I mentioned earlier, my metaphor here alludes to Gotthold Lessing, who first proposed that there was a huge gap between faith and history. In terms of our concerns today, the gap might be posited as one between outer and objective historical truth and inner and subjective spiritual truth. In biblical scholarship, the gap has been seen more as one interposed between the text and faith. The Christian may therefore feel that she stands not so much on the edge of one chasm, but on a narrow promontory between two chasms, with mental health across the other side of one and the Bible over and across the other side of the other. I say this not to cause you to experience mental vertigo during the lecture, but rather in order to draw attention to the religious anxiety that this may cause. In this context, the defenses of biblical literalism on the one hand and compartmentalization of life on the other can seem very attractive. However, they come at great cost, and I wish to argue that a better integration of our thinking about the science and theology of mental health has much to offer if we only have the courage to embark upon the bridge building that it requires. So in this context, I would like to do some bridge building this evening. But I am aware that I am not the first to attempt the task. Well before Boyle's time, controversial attempts had been made to do something similar. In The Discovery of Witchcraft, published in 1584, Reginald Scott wrote, "As touching those that are said in the gospel to be possessed of spirits, it seemeth in many places that it is indifferent or all one to say he is possessed with a devil, or he is lunatic or frenetic, which disease in these days is said to proceed of melancholy." The idea that the gospel accounts of demon possession refer to what Scott would call melancholy, or we would call mental illness, was controversial then and remains so now, at least in some Christian circles. It is not controversial in the psychiatric literature, where there seems to be a pervasive, largely unquestioned assumption that what we call mental illness today was understood as demon possession in history. In fact, this is quite unconvincing to any clinical psychiatrist who takes time to read the Gospels carefully and should be much more professionally controversial than it is. The only exorcism by Jesus, of someone whom a psychiatrist today might recognize as suffering from a mental illness is that of the Garrisons Maniac. Of the others exorcised by Jesus, one appears to be suffering from epilepsy, another is blind, and yet another mute. In 2 other cases, we are given no information at all that would be supportive of any diagnosis, but there is no evidence of mental illness. The Garrisons Maniac is interesting, not least because we are told that Jesus restores him to his right mind. He is usually diagnosed by medical commentators as suffering from a major mental disorder, such as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Biblical scholars commonly say little or nothing about his mental state, preferring to focus on debates about where the event took place. However, this one case hardly gives strong support to the argument that demon possession then is what we call mental illness now. Nor were people of Jesus' time ignorant of the difference. So controversial was Jesus in what he did and in what he taught that there seems to have been a debate about whether he was either mad or demon-possessed. The two could potentially manifest in similar ways, but they were not understood as being the same thing. Much more could be said about the Garrisons Maniac, and I have written about this elsewhere. But in passing, we should note that the healing that Jesus brings restores this man in body, mind, and spirit within his community. He is socially reintegrated, and he finds a new vocation in telling others what Jesus has done for him. Any account of this episode that focuses exclusively on the demonic misses the point completely. An historical critical reading of the text gives us reason to question any reductive demonology imposed by modern readers. We should not assume that the practices, beliefs, and traditions of some contemporary charismatic and Pentecostal churches are the same as those of Jesus as portrayed in the Synoptic Gospels. But for now, I want to turn to Jesus' teaching. It seems to me that this is where the Christian tendency to compartmentalize becomes the greatest. Jesus is revered by all as a great teacher, but usually his teachings are placed in ethical and spiritual pigeonholes. He is rarely lauded as psychologically perceptive, albeit he is seen as compassionate towards the poor and vulnerable in society and is critical of those who fail to help them. Jesus is seen as psychologically sensitive and socially active, but not as a go-to source of insights concerning mental health. I should perhaps pause in passing to dismiss one potential exception here. There are those who have argued that most of the healings and exorcisms that Jesus performed were of conditions that we would diagnose as psychogenic in origin. This was proposed, for example, by Donald Capps in a book entitled Jesus, the Village Psychiatrist. According to this view, Jesus was a charismatic healer, and the diagnoses of the people whom he healed were really psychiatric conditions, such as somatoform disorder, not physical ones. I'm not really convinced by this argument, but even if I was, I don't think that this makes Jesus a psychiatrist, nor does it affect what I want to say here about Jesus' teachings. So as an example or case study, I'd like to talk about anxiety. Anxiety, along with depression, is one of the key symptoms of the common mental disorders that affect around 1 in 5 adults worldwide today. We have no reason to believe that such problems were any less in Jesus' day than they are now. Anxiety, like fear, affects us physically as well as psychologically. For convenience, I'll call the psychological component of anxiety worry, but the two usually go together. We worry about the things we care about, our families, our health, our work, our faith. And worry, like physical pain, is helpful. It focuses our attention on things that matter. It stops us from burying our heads in the sand, like the proverbial ostrich. But it can also get out of hand. When it is excessive, it can immobilize us and make life miserable. When it occurs in inappropriate situations or pervasively, we may have little or no conscious awareness of what the real root of the problem is, and so we cannot respond effectively. This is where psychiatry comes in, and we now have a range of effective treatments for anxiety disorders, amongst which the currently popular and evidence-based options are justified on scientific principles derived from empirical controlled trials and drawing on the disciplinary frameworks of psychopharmacology and cognitive behavioral psychology. Jesus had some important things to say about worry, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount, and there is reason to believe that the tradition of this teaching was known to Paul. For example, in his letter to the Philippians, Paul writes, "Do not worry about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." This is not so very different to what Jesus has to say in the Sermon on the Mount. "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing?" These texts, or rather a certain kind of misinterpretation of them, have only increased the anxiety of some Christians. It easily seems as though Jesus and Paul are telling us that we shouldn't worry, or that worry is sinful. This has added guilt and shame to the burdens that anxious Christians carry. But none of us can simply decide not to worry. It doesn't work like that. In fact, Paul talks of all his anxiety for all the churches. And Jesus is distressed and agitated in Gethsemane concerning his impending fate. So we should not imagine that either of them lived in a perpetual state of emotional calm in the face of life's greatest challenges. Rather, they both had important things to tell us about how we should handle anxiety and worry when they come our way. And in particular, both Paul and Jesus redirect us to prayer as the appropriate coping response. Jesus also engages in an extended reflection on what anxiety tells us about our true priorities. "Therefore do not worry, saying, 'What will we eat, or what will we drink, or what will we wear?' For it is the Gentiles who strive for all these things, and indeed your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. But strive first for the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." Jesus challenges us to live in the present and not to allow our minds to be distracted by what may or may not happen in the future. "So do not worry about tomorrow," he says in Matthew's Gospel, "for tomorrow will bring worries of its own. Today's trouble is enough for today." We might identify here some of the key techniques of CBT for managing anxiety, but Jesus does not confine himself to this model of psychotherapy. In an interesting parable concerning guilt and blame later in the same sermon in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus says, "Why do you see the speck in your neighbour's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbour, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' while the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbour's eye." This passage closely follows after Jesus' teaching about anxiety, and yet the link seems to be all but completely missed by biblical scholars and commentators. The connection is well known to psychodynamic therapists. In the psychoanalytic tradition and its derivative therapies, various psychological defense mechanisms against anxiety are identified, including one called projection. In projection, some aspect of mental content that causes anxiety in the self is mentally relocated or projected onto another person so as to reduce anxiety. Thus, for example, I might be feeling that I have not worked hard enough, that I am a failure, and that I should have achieved more. I feel both anxious and guilty about this, but more at an unconscious level than something that I am consciously aware of. I am seen by others to be constantly complaining that colleagues at work are lazy, or perhaps I place excessive emphasis upon my children's education, one of whom is here this evening, and put pressure on them to succeed. I see in others the very thing that I am so unhappy with in myself. By projecting this onto someone else and blaming them, I avoid experiencing my own anxiety. However, this also makes it difficult to resolve. Insight into what is going on, making conscious that which is unconscious, is half the solution. It seems to me that the parable of the speck and the log describes exactly this kind of psychological dynamic. I have scoured commentaries of Matthew's Gospel in vain and have yet to find one in which this teaching of Jesus is identified as being concerned with the psychological defense mechanism of projection. The connection has not been missed by psychotherapists. For example, Brown and Pedder, in their introductory textbook on psychotherapy, refer to Jesus as recognizing this. Jesus' teaching on this is even acknowledged in the online Wikipedia article on psychological projection. Psychotherapists who are not Christians apparently understand this particular text better than most biblical scholars appear to. But perhaps that is just me projecting my failings onto the biblical scholars. At the heart of the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' teaching that we know as the Lord's Prayer. Paul's injunction to the Philippians not to worry is explicitly linked to the injunction to pray. Anxiety is thus located within the tradition of Jesus' teaching as being something that should impel us towards prayer. Prayer is, we might say, the Christian coping mechanism for dealing with anxiety. In fact, when you think about it, prayer is very similar to worry. Worry and prayer are both the giving of attention to the things that concern us. The differences are in theological perspective, the God-directedness of prayer, and the willingness to challenge ourselves as to whether or not we really worry about the right things. It is actually a small step to turn worry into prayer, and the Lord's Prayer directs our attention to how we might reorientate our priorities in support of this. It directs our attention to the overriding priorities of the coming of God's kingdom, the kingdom that was at the heart of Jesus' teaching ministry. Subsequent Christian tradition has developed countless variations on how to pray about the things that worry us. The Jesus prayer, centering prayer, or the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, for example, all offer prayerful ways of addressing our anxieties and probing the desires that they reflect within us. The Sermon on the Mount begins and ends with warnings that appearances can be deceptive, and we should take these seriously. Jesus' opening words are, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Much ink has been spilled in attempts to identify exactly whom Jesus is referring to as poor in spirit. In Luke's Gospel, in the Sermon on the Plain, it is simply the poor who are said to be blessed. It is difficult, however, to avoid the conclusion that poverty of spirit has an inner and emotional reference. We are thus left with the psychological paradox that those who are said to be blessed are the ones who don't feel blessed. The second beatitude refers directly to those who mourn, and the third to those who are meek. Perhaps then the anxious may be blessed too. When later in the sermon, Jesus says that we shouldn't worry about what we eat or drink, is this a reminder of the fourth beatitude, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness? It is what we are anxious about that matters. The phenomenology of anxiety in itself does not tell us who is blessed and who is not. There may well be some very anxious people who are far more spiritually and mentally healthy than others who have no anxieties at all. Spiritual and mental health are highly paradoxical. Taking this example of anxiety and worry, we thus find that Jesus did teach about something that we consider to be a central feature of common mental disorders. Mental health is actually one of the key themes of the Sermon on the Mount. It is there as a part of Jesus' teaching on prayer and the kingdom of heaven. Christian prayer is a psychological as well as a spiritual practice. Mental and spiritual well-being are inextricably linked. But appearances can be deceptive, and those who look least as though they are flourishing may in fact be those who are spiritually and mentally most healthy. Judging from my reading of commentaries on the Sermon on the Mount, most biblical scholars have not properly taken this on board, nor have many psychiatrists or psychologists. However, a variety of spiritually and religiously integrated forms of psychotherapy now give explicit attention to the ways in which scriptural and religious teachings may be used to facilitate recovery from mental ill health. They are adapted to different religious traditions, and of course, Christian theology is not imposed upon Muslims or Hindus, or vice versa. As an example, one Christian version of a religiously integrated CBT manual suggests that the texts that I quoted above from Matthew 6 might be useful in helping the patient to identify certain kinds of thinking errors in which they hold fears about the future. The manual is adapted from one originally devised by the psychologist Aaron Beck and reflects his understanding of the cognitive processes that underlie depression and anxiety. The Christian is enabled to reflect on these in therapy as consistent with the teachings of Jesus. The links between Christian theology and mental health practices are there for those who wish to make them. Mindfulness, a practice of attentive awareness of the present moment, is now seen as a spiritual therapy which has particular benefits for depression and anxiety. It is usually seen as drawing on Buddhist practice, but actually it shares much in common with Christian contemplative prayer and with Jesus' teaching about today's trouble being enough for today. As a component of compassion-focused therapy, it gives expression to Jesus' teaching on loving our neighbours as ourselves. And forgiveness therapy, now seen to be valuable in a wide range of psychiatric disorders, draws further on one of the key themes of the Lord's Prayer and has a substantial evidence base to support its efficacy. I could go on, but I hope that by now you get the picture. I would suggest, therefore, that there is ample evidence, at least in Matthew's Gospel, that Jesus' teaching on the kingdom of God was both psychological and spiritual in nature. Each depends upon the other, but neither can be reduced to the other without losing something important. This should not be surprising to us, given scientific research and theological thinking about the nature of the relationship between mind, brain, and spirit. Philip Clayton's Boyle Lecture in 2006, for example, addressed this eloquently. It is an astonishing feat of compartmentalization that we have persuaded ourselves collectively that we can talk about spiritual and mental well-being in isolation from each other, and our success in doing so has cost us dearly. On the one hand, we have deprived ourselves of many of the benefits to mental health that the Christian gospel and the spiritual practices that have emerged from it over the last 2 millennia potentially have. Buddhism is now seen as the source of spiritual wisdom on mindfulness and compassion amongst many mental health professionals, and Christians are seen as having little to offer. I'm not saying that we can't learn anything from the Buddhists, but as Christians, we have not done well in sharing the resources of our own tradition with others. On the other hand, we have impoverished the gospel of its power to speak to the integral nature of the human condition as physical, social, psychological, and spiritual. We have divided up the human soul and outsourced our psychological work to science and medicine. This is not how things were in the Gospels. The kingdom of God is presented by Jesus in Matthew's Gospel as a place of human flourishing in body, mind, and spirit. Just as there is no health without mental health, there is no mental health, I would suggest, without spiritual health. Equally, there is no spiritual health without mental health. But before I finish, I want to further challenge our understanding of the fundamental nature of mental health. If, as I am suggesting, we have lost any sense of the integrated, indivisible, and holistic nature of the vision of human flourishing that the Gospels portray, what should a Christian understanding of mental health look like within the kingdom of God in terms that reflect and engage with our present scientific understandings of the nature of mental health? Given that I have said that mental health will be inseparable from spiritual well-being, it should be possible to articulate this in such a way as to avoid compartmentalization. It should be possible to communicate psychological flourishing in spiritual terms and spiritual flourishing in psychological terms. The challenge will be to do this in such a way as to preserve the authentic and distinctive insights of the Christian gospel without being unnecessarily exclusive. Of course, any such venture always will be exclusive, insofar as it will affirm the uniqueness of what Jesus said and did. However, it should be inclusive, as Jesus was, of those who are excluded and on the margins, of those who are poor in spirit. So I would like to suggest that from a gospel perspective, mental health is a state of well-being in which a person is able to fulfill their vocation within the kingdom of God. And for the purposes of a dialogue between science and theology, we might articulate this in a slightly different way, as a state of well-being in which a person is able to show attentive awareness of self, others, and a transcendent reality. In no way do I wish to retract my Christian emphasis on the radical way in which this transcendent reality is given unique expression by Jesus, in word and in deed, in the gospel narratives. However, we have to be able to have a dialogue, and I hope that this definition might facilitate that. So let's conclude by returning to our consideration of Agnes. While she is still in the place of social and emotional exclusion that her depressive disorder has consigned her to, a psychologist, who is not a Christian, teaches her how to engage in the practice of mindfulness. Recognizing that she is a Christian, he refers her to the mental health chaplain, who makes some recommendations for her for some reading on mindfulness and Christian prayer. Agnes still feels depressed. She is poor in spirit, but she does find that attentive awareness to simple things gradually becomes a place of daily prayer, and that this in turn enables her to reconnect with a faint and fragile sense of the presence of God in her life. Gradually this grows, and along with it her mood improves. Eventually, she is able to return to church, and her friends there welcome her back and tell her that they are glad that she is feeling better. Within this narrative of recovery, a psychologist and a chaplain have both played a significant part. But church is only there at the beginning and at the end. It isn't a central part of the story at all. Let's compare this with the story of the Garrisons Maniac. This man is alienated from his community by his mental disorder at the beginning of the story and reintegrated at the end. He has this in common with Agnes. The agent of change, Jesus, is at the heart of the action in Gerasa and brings about salvation in body, mind, and spirit. This part of the story looks very different. It is the good old NHS that has brought about most of the changes for Agnes, and they have focused primarily on restoration of mind. The mental health professionals haven't completely forgotten the spiritual dimension of things, but neither have they made it a central or integrated concern. And finally, the Garrison man has a new vocation. He has good news to share of a new awareness of himself and his community and Jesus. Agnes has a similar sense of gratitude, but she still finds it difficult to join up the fragments. Where was God in all of this, and what does it have to do with her Christian faith? Where were her church friends when she needed them most? How can she talk to them now about her experiences? Does her church know how to have this conversation with her? Underlying the difficulties that Agnes has with talking about these things in her church, there is a difficulty that clergy, theologians, mental health professionals, and scientists have with pursuing a properly interdisciplinary conversation between science and theology as to the nature of mental and spiritual well-being. This is not just an academic debate. It has direct relevance to the clinical and pastoral care of men and women like Agnes. We need much more dialogue at every level. Thank you.
There is indeed, as he says, a conceptual problem on how to relate the gospel and mental health. We're not just dealing with different languages for the same thing. Demon possession is not just the same thing as psychosis or epilepsy. Psychiatry and the gospel are saying different things about mental health, not just using different words for the same thing. Nevertheless, there's a close connection between what psychiatry and the gospel are saying. They're offering distinct but interconnected perspectives. And there can be and should be, as Chris is saying, more crosstalk between them than has normally occurred. We often seem to struggle with this kind of conceptual relationship where we have two distinguishable but interconnected perspectives. One trap is that we fail to recognize a distinction when one needs to be made, as when we fail to recognize that psychiatry and theology are making distinct contributions, not just saying the same thing in different words. But if we get as far as making the distinction, we then often create divisions and imagine that the perspectives we've distinguished are completely disconnected from one another. It's a problem of which the poet and philosopher Samuel Taylor Coleridge was very much aware in general terms. He recognized more clearly than most that a lot of philosophical problems arise from taking mere distinctions and turning them into divisions. The perspective of theology and psychiatry are distinguishable, but they should not be divided from one another because there are strong connections between them. Psychiatry and the gospel are looking at things from different perspectives and embedding what they say in different discourses, which make different background assumptions. However, I'm enough of a philosophical realist to assume that they're triangulating on the same phenomenon. Neither perspective says everything that can be said. Both are selective, but they leave out different things. There's a rough analogy in the relationship between the conscious mind and the physical brain. Mind talk and brain talk are looking at things from different points of view, but looking at the same double aspect reality. For example, there's a single process of going to sleep, but that can be monitored in different ways by the conscious mind and by brain recordings. The relationship between religion and mental health is very complex, as everyone knows. Most of the research data is correlational and, as Chris says, shows a generally positive association between religion and mental health. However, we're all really more interested in what the causal effects there might be. And that's largely speculative, though research is improving. Religion can influence mental health, but equally, mental health can influence religion. Or yet again, an apparent association between the two can reflect the impact of some third variable, such as socioeconomic status, on both religion and mental health. And it's all very difficult to sort out. I believe that religion is often good for mental health, but there are probably some kinds of religion that are bad for it. Religion can become a manifestation of poor mental health. For example, people with obsessional tendencies can become highly obsessional about religion itself, and such religious manifestations of poor mental health can further entrench and exacerbate mental health problems. It sometimes seems as though there's a tug of war going on. Religion can get sucked into mental health problems and exacerbate them. On the other hand, healthy forms of religion can help to liberate people from their mental health problems. And which of those two predominates is a subtle and complex matter. But leaving all that complexity aside, I want to focus for a moment on how religion can be good for mental health. And here I welcome the fact that Chris has chosen to talk not about religion in general, but largely, more specifically, about the gospel and Jesus. I want to try to probe a little further the mental health implications of the Jesus we know from the Gospels. Jesus features in the Christian religion in a variety of different ways. In contemporary evangelical Christianity, there's a quasi-romantic relationship with a highly spiritualized Jesus. In the Catholic tradition, there's a veneration of the real presence of Jesus in the sacraments. In the later writings of St. Paul, there's a rather mystical awareness of the cosmic significance of Christ that's also found in forms of Christianity influenced by New Age. And all of these impact on mental health in different ways, and now is not the time to sort all that out. But Chris Cook's main interest is in the Jesus of the Gospels, and that's my central interest too. Jesus was clearly a highly charismatic individual who had a profound impact on the thoughts, feelings, and behavior of those who met him. He's not just a historical figure. He can be internalized, rather as most children internalize their parents as they grow up. Parents become their constant companions, observing and commenting on what they're doing, even when they're not physically present. Christians sometimes internalize Jesus in a somewhat similar way. Though in saying that, of course, I'm not suggesting that there's nothing more to Jesus than a historical figure who's been internalized psychologically. Jesus was a Jew, and those who are steeped in the Jewish tradition often seem to get Jesus better than those of us who are not. One of the best portrayals of Jesus I know was by Werner and Lottie Peltz in a book published in 1962, rather misleadingly entitled God is No More. I guess that was a title the publishers supplied to get sales. In my opinion, it was much the best of the clutch of radical theology books published at that time. Peltz was fascinated by how Jesus used words in his encounters with people and was sharply critical of the idea that Jesus was a teacher. To say Jesus was a teacher suggests he talked in a much more systematic way than was actually the case. The Jesus of the Gospels talks in a puzzling and enigmatic way. He teased and provoked and disrupted pre-existing assumptions. Above all, he consistently disrupted the idea that we know what is possible and what is not, and that we have to settle for the rather limited reality to which we have become accustomed. At the start of John's Gospel, Jesus says, "Follow me, and you will see the heavens open." He tells the woman at the well that if she drinks the water he will give her, she will never be thirsty again, because streams of water will well up within her. Jesus consistently seems to be provoking people into believing that more is possible than they had supposed. His message, as Peltz sees it, is essentially one of promise. And the chapter titles of Peltz's book include The Promise of Committal, The Promise of Wholeness and Loveliness, The Promise of the Neighbor, The Promise of the City, and The Promise of Lawlessness. The Greek word for the new mindset that Jesus seems to want to open up in people is metanoia, a new heart and mind. We usually translate this word as repentance, but that gives a misleading impression of what Jesus was trying to achieve. Bishop Stephen Verney put it well in saying that metanoia points to something beyond our comprehension. To quote him, We're being commanded by Jesus to let go what we thought we knew. It's a return home to something profoundly old and a discovery that something radically new. Our eyes are to be open to see everything differently, and our desire is to be transformed. We are to be no longer individuals in control of our own lives, but to enter into the dance of love with God and with each other. Jesus seems to have been more interested in creating belief in future possibilities than in inducing regrets about the past. Though I don't want in any way to play down just what a radical change in mindset metanoia involves. St. Teresa understood this when she said that it's a great grace of God to practice self-examination, but too much is as bad as too little, as they say. Believe me, by God's help, we shall advance more by contemplating the divinity than by keeping our eyes fixed on ourselves. Jesus was something of a positive psychologist ahead of his time. Jesus characteristically begins encounters with people by expanding their horizons about what might be possible. But he never downplays the cost. There are numerous remarks about the sacrifice that will have to be made to find the pearl of great price. And seemingly aware of how daunting this might all seem, he also encourages people to believe that if they take the risk of leading this new kind of life, they will find they are supported in it. The implications of all this for mental health are profound and far-reaching. The psychological framework that seems closest to a translation of how Jesus sets about transforming people is perhaps that of C.G. Jung. He takes over from Freud the concept of the ego, the center of consciousness, but adds a concept of the self, usually spelt with a capital letter as a way of indicating that Jung uses the word as a technical term, meaning the higher and more complete person that it is possible for us to become. Some might suspect that this is to reduce the gospel to mere psychology, but that would be a misunderstanding of what Jung is up to. In many ways, Jung's psychological theory can be seen as a translation into fresh-sounding psychological language of perennial spiritual wisdom. It is spiritual wisdom masquerading as psychology rather than spiritual wisdom reduced to psychology. Jesus' impact on mental health is crystallized in the advice that Chris elucidated so well. Not to worry, but to pray instead. Worry and prayer start from the same life circumstances, but worry drags us down, whereas prayer points towards what is possible and lifts the spirit. Prayer creates its own more positive reality. Increasingly in recent years, I've passed on Jesus' advice to pray rather than worry. And if the word prayer is problematic, I can rephrase the advice in an acceptable translation. And my experience is that this advice of Jesus is remarkably helpful. And I'm deeply grateful to Chris Cook for the clear way he has this evening presented Jesus' advice to pray rather than worry, and indeed for his clear and beautifully crafted Boyle Lecture. Thank you.
May I add my warm thanks and yours to both our speakers for their preparation, the reach of their ideas, and the clarity of their expression. I'm delighted to announce that the Boyle Lecture 2021 will take place here on the 3rd of February next year, and that the lecturer will be Professor Tom McLeish, Fellow of the Royal Society, Professor of Natural Philosophy at the University of York, who will address Rediscovering Science as Contemplation. A response to his lecture will be given by the Right Reverend Dr. Rowan Williams, lately Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge, among very much else. Thank you for your interest, your kind presence, and appreciated attendance.